I've always found that there's been more of a need for food scientists than a supply.
Uh-huh.
So usually someone who graduates with their degree in food science, they can usually get a job fairly quickly.
Interesting.
A lot goes into bringing a new food product to market. Food scientists are the people who are behind the scenes of all the packaged and fresh, all food products that are eaten and brought to market.
Those crispy chips to jazz up your mood, the silky smooth pot of yogurt for a quick snack, or those mixes that turn you into an instant baker. Ever wondered who discovered those? Or how do they come into existence? Welcome to the fascinating world of food science, where innovation meets nutrition and taste. Unsung heroes behind the safety, quality, and deliciousness of the food we eat every day are food scientists. These dedicated professionals combine principles from chemistry, biology, and physics to develop new food products, enhance the existing flavors, and ensure our food is safe and nutritious. My guest today is Rachel Zemser, a veteran food scientist, an adjunct professor at San Francisco State University, and a food industry consultant at A La Carte Connections. In this episode, Rachel takes us through the world of food scientists and shares her advice for those who want to be one.
This is Career Calling, and I'm your host, Pratibha Pandit. Hi, Rachel. Welcome to Career Calling.
Hi.
I'm really thrilled to have you here because I'm a foodie, but I'm one of those foodies, like probably many of them, who do not understand the lot of the action that goes behind the scenes when we purchase those food products. So I'm really excited to learn about your field. I always start from the very basics. The first question that I have is, who is a food scientist? What do they do?
So food scientists are the people who are behind the scenes of all the packaged and fresh, I guess, all food products that are eaten and brought to market. A food scientist has a hand involved in the work behind the scenes. We are made up of chemists and biologists and flavorists and engineers, and we work in all different aspects of the food industry, everything from food safety to food chemistry to creating new flavors to coming up with new starches and thickeners and gums and stabilizers, keeping things fresh in the package, keeping things crunchy, making sure things don't get soggy, and so on, but preventing bacteria from growing. So these are all the different kinds of tasks that food scientists are involved in. So there's lots of different types of food scientists, and there's degrees that are more general, and then there's higher degrees that are more specialized. But it's a very big field, and there's not a lot that's known about it. It's sort of like the secret food industry.
Yep, very much. What is the difference between culinary art and culinary science?
So
Is there one?
years ago, there used to be the chefs and there used to be the scientists. And food scientists would get food science degrees and chefs would get culinary arts degrees. But in the last 15, 20 years, there's been a need for the two sides to work together. And because of that, there's been some new degrees that have emerged in the last 15 years. And they have names like culinary science, culinology, and things like that. And they educate the student in a 4-year degree in both food science and culinary arts, like kind of a little bit of both. And that way the student can kind of fast track in their career into a job that requires both of those skills rather than get a full-on culinary arts degree and a full-on food science. They can combine both and kind of just be ready to go, a package deal right out of school.
Mm-hmm. Is it common now, chefs having food science degree? Or
No, I mean, it's a lot more common. There's an organization called the Research Chef Association. That's culinology.org. And I don't remember exactly when they were founded, joined back in maybe like 96 or 97. I didn't know, it was very young back then. So I guess 25 plus years. And their goal was to create programs that brought together the chef and food science education. So there's more and more programs, more and more people going into the field. So it's more common than it used to be, for sure. It's still not, there's still probably more chefs and food scientists, but there's more and more people who are interested in getting both backgrounds.
One of the interesting things that occurred to me when I was researching was when, as a consumer, I go into a grocery store or a market and I purchase a pot of yogurt or a bag of chips or anything else. It is food for me, but it is a product for the company. So that kind of unveils a whole new dimension. I'm a product professional myself in the technology industry. To me, that was like, that's a whole new dimension of so many things that must come together for that product to come to existence. Can you give a little bit of a intro of what goes on? Like, what does it take to introduce a food product?
So a lot goes into bringing a new food product to market. And it could be a whole brand new food item that never existed before, or it could be a variation on something that already exists. So yogurt, for example, there's many, many kinds of yogurts on the market. But let's just say that a company wants to come out with a low sugar yogurt using a new sugar alternative. It would usually start off with the food scientists figuring out how are we going to formulate this? How are we going to create this product so it has a nice flavor profile so that the sugar levels are reduced versus the full sugar version of before. What container size will it be made into? What will the serving size be? What will the nutritional panel be all about? And then we do some tests in the lab. We do some experiments and, we make little batches of yogurt. And then once we're happy with it, then we have to bring in the marketing department and make sure that they like it and they can market it and sell it. And usually there's other members of the company that get involved and everybody tastes together. And then of course they have like shelf life studies because we have to make sure it's going to last for 2, 4, 6 months, however long that process for on the market. And finally, after all, then we do production runs. We have to do a test run in the manufacturing plant, make sure that it can be made properly, that it's going to flow through all the equipment, that the viscosity will be the right consistency. There might be engineers involved in this point in the manufacturing plant, the ones who work with all the equipment and make sure that everything is tinkered with correctly to make sure it flows out of the cup properly. And after the test is done, we might let the cup sit around for a while, see how long it lasts, make sure it ages in a way that is desirable, like it's not going to taste bad after a week. And after all the checks are done, then it's officially launched and put on the market, maybe in some test markets to begin, and then it kind of expands to nationwide.
Is it usually the larger food companies that are able to put these products? What happens to the individuals or the small businesses or home businesses? Do they have food scientists accessible to them? Do they have to take them through the same process?
Well, if it's a small company like an entrepreneur that wants to bring a product to market, would go through a similar process, but because they would be an individual or maybe a small group of people who raised money to bring this new idea to market, they're going to work with a co-packer or they're going to work with a third-party manufacturer that does similar things to what they want. So maybe that person would go to a yogurt company that made yogurt for many different companies versus like just a Dannon plant or just a Fage yogurt company. This would be maybe a company that makes yogurt for everybody. So they would have to work with that kind of a co-packer. And that co-packer would do all of the technical steps to make sure that it was brought to market, but all the marketing and sales and so on would be up to the entrepreneur. And as far as people who work from home, I guess you're thinking maybe of cottage industry, people who want to sell things at the farmer's market, either directly or indirectly to people. That is really a whole different category. I mean, they could work with a food scientist if they wanted to, but those people are usually more chefs and crafty people who are doing things in their home and making it and selling it from their home. They probably wouldn't need to go to a manufacturing plant or a production facility unless they started growing and becoming very popular. And then they might want to go down that path because products made in your own home have a whole other set of regulations attached to it. You have to label it made in a home kitchen. It can only be sold, in farmers markets and things like that. So once you kind of go big time and you want to sell like in lots of stores across the nation, then you really have to work with the manufacturers and co-packers.
I see. Now, coming back to the profession of food scientists, what are the work settings you will be working in? Is it usually the food companies that hire food scientists, or do you have your own consultancy? Can you give a little bit of what are the different work settings, like organizations food scientists can be hired?
Yeah, I myself am a consultant. So I work with small entrepreneurs and large entrepreneurs, basically anyone that doesn't have their own food science R&D team. Or sometimes a company does have their own R&D team, but maybe they're really busy and they just need some extra support. And then they might bring someone like me on
Mhm.
board. But other companies, large companies like Kraft or Unilever or Nestle, or really just any food company that you might see on the supermarket shelf, a brand name that you're familiar with, they probably have their own internal team of food scientists and engineers and food safety specialists and managers and team leaders and things like that. So they have their own set team in place that are working only on their own products.
Mhm.
Whereas a consultant like me will help a variety of people out there.
Mhm. So it is the food companies, the independent practice. Is there any other type? Like, do large supermarkets, do they hire food scientists, or is there government,
Yes, government, FDA, USDA, working for the government, making sure that our food supply is safe, working in regulations, making sure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, inspectors and so on. That's definitely another area.
Mhm.
Yes, a supermarket might hire food scientists if it's a supermarket that puts out their own brands.
Hmm.
So Safeway, for example, might have their own food team of food scientists. Maybe a Whole Foods, if they had the 365 brand, they may have a facility somewhere that works on that. But it's really hard to say because sometimes the 365 could be created by small independent consulting
White
firms
labels.
that
Mhm.
have created it for them, and they just Whole Foods just puts their own name on it.
Mhm.
So a lot of different channels, and over the years, the rules have kind of evolved and changed to who hires the food scientists. Before, it used to just be government and large food companies. But the world of food has changed a lot, the kinds of companies that bring products to market. Ben and Jerry's was one of the early small companies. And since then, there's just been a slew of smaller companies that have made it big or smaller companies that stay small and consultants, big consulting companies, small consulting companies, independent, large conglomerates. There's just really a big array of places for a food scientist to land.
Mhm. I was looking at, like I said, your website, and I really found it very fascinating that one little deck you have, the presentation you have about your journey. It was very refreshing to see the very honest journey of your career. I would really love to hear, how did you first stumble upon food science as an area, and how did you go about building your career in it?
So when I was in high school, I really didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I knew it was going to be something in the sciences. I wasn't really the English major or history major type.
Mhm.
And I remember at the time my sister was going to the University of Massachusetts, and that was my state university. And I thought, well, I want to go there too.
Mhm.
And I started looking through their big book of back then. We had books. We didn't have online
Mhm.
websites for universities. We got a big, huge book in the mail, and we had to kind of flip through it and figure out what our major was going to be. And I saw food science, and I thought, oh, well, that could be interesting. And I didn't know anything about it really.
Mhm.
It just seemed like it would be kind of fun. And I didn't know anyone who was doing it, so I thought it would be unique and different. And when I got to the university, they had their orientation. I remember I actually went to the food science department at the University of Massachusetts, and I walked in and I went to the admin and I said, "Hey, I want to be in this department." And they said, "Oh, that's great. We love getting students when they're freshmen because there really weren't a lot of food scientists or people who knew about it. So they were very anxious to kind of snatch me in there and get me going. And they handed me my 4-year program itinerary, and they invited me to a barbecue the next day that the department was having. And it just always turned out to be a good fit. So UMass was a very large university, but the food science department was quite
Mhm.
small at the time. It's grown a lot since then. I think my graduating class had 3.
Oh,
This
wow.
was, in the
Mhm.
90s. Now I think that there's probably 100 or more graduating students every semester.
Mhm.
Maybe not 100, but there's a lot more in the department now. At least I haven't checked the counts, but back then there just weren't a lot of people in the field, and now there's just way more people that know about it, and there's much more outreach in high school to educate future students about food science as a career.
Mhm. Mhm. That's amazing that you went into it without knowing, and then it seemed like you hit the bullseye in finding your passion, considering you're still doing it. That's really amazing.
Yeah, yeah, I got lucky.
Yeah, that's really amazing. Is it typically food scientists, do they tend to have undergrad is enough, or it is more common to have a master's degree at least to go into the workforce? Is there a like each industry has different levels that is expected? Like certain industries, you have to have a PhD, for example, and stuff like that. How is it in the food science?
It really depends on the food on that student wants to do. I always encourage my assistants and interns that come through my lab to get a master's degree because the 2 extra years will give you extra opportunities down the road that you may not get with just a bachelor's degree. And it'll start you off at a higher salary. So, but it's not necessary. One can get a bachelor's degree and get a job in food science quickly afterwards. I think that larger companies, especially big companies on the East Coast like Kraft and Mondelez and Unilever and Nestle, really big corporations, they tend to lean towards people, Pepsi. They're going to want people with at least a master's degree. But I also feel like out in California, there's a lot of smaller companies and they also have less food scientists to pick from. So they're a little more kind of lenient on the degrees with the smaller companies. So yeah, I think you don't have to have a master's, but it doesn't hurt. When it comes to PhDs, I think if you're going to get a PhD, then one has to be prepared or really thinking about a job either in academics or being a real specialist in one kind of thing at a food company. So someone might get a PhD in protein and maybe they'll get a job working at a company that is really focusing on protein powders or something like that. And that PhD that they learned and the research that they did is going to serve them in that protein company at a very high level of a job. Whereas, most people, they can get their master's and their bachelor's and they can get a job either as an entry level or maybe as a mid-level. But I think when it comes to being like a senior or a manager in the food industry, you still need that experience. You still have to do your time, even with a master's or a bachelor's or a PhD. You can't just jump in and be like head of R&D. I mean, you could, and a company might think that if they hire with a PhD that they're getting someone who's going to be qualified, but there's so much that goes into being a manager and a director and managing projects beyond just the scientific information that you may have that I think sometimes food companies don't say just hire someone with a high degree thinking they can run the company and they can't necessarily do that. So, yeah.
That's a good segue for my next question is the types of specializations. Are there different types of specializations that differentiates food scientists among themselves? And what are those common ones?
Well, most universities will have a general food science degree where you get all the basics in, chemistry, microbiology, biology. There's prerequisites that, where you're kind of lumped in with like the pre-med students and things like that. And then you do more food science type work in the last 2 years. Every university has a slightly different program, and all the accredited ones are on the IFT, Institute of Food Technology website. Those are all the accredited food science programs in the United States, maybe even internationally too. But there are some programs where maybe in your last year, you can take extra classes in protein or carbs or candy making or bakery. But a lot of food science departments do have to kind of have some basic requirements that they have to fill. So they have to fit in all of that. If someone wants to specialize, they might get that more in a master's degree program where they can pick a professor who is getting paid either by industry or by government to do research in a certain area of food. And you can jump in and work with that professor. So when I got my master's, I worked in a food safety, food microbiology laboratory. And my professor had a grant from the USDA on studying Listeria monocytogenes. So that's what I did. It doesn't mean that I had to go out and work in that particular field. I ended up not becoming a food microbiologist. I'm very knowledgeable about it, but I don't work in food micro. It does help me with the other parts of my job though. But there are people that might want to study starches and carbohydrates, and then they could go into the bakery industry. But when you get a master's, you can really go wherever you want because it's specialized. So you might have more of an interest or opportunity to work in something that you got your master's in, but it doesn't necessarily have to be going down that path. I think there are certain programs across the US where they might focus on one area versus another. And there's always extra classes that food scientists can take that are taught sort of as an outreach. For example, the University of Wisconsin offers classes that you pay a fee taught by professors for food scientists on how to get into candy making or ice cream making. They're like short courses. And those are usually very, very specific and you learn a lot and it's very applicable towards what you want to do. So there's always opportunities like that afterwards, or you just learn on the job, once you get in and you just kind of become an expert eventually after 5-10 years.
Let's talk about getting in part. Usually, most common in any industry is the how to start. How do you break in to an industry after formal education? And what does a career path look like? Right. So I want to understand what is the common way from education, formal education to getting a job? Is it usually through internships or is there anything else that you need to have a portfolio of your work or something like that? What is the common way for somebody to break into industry after having formal education?
You know, I've always found that there's been more of a need for food scientists than a supply.
Uh-huh.
So usually someone who graduates with their degree in food science, they can usually get a job fairly quickly.
Interesting.
Sometimes it might be difficult if they live in an area of the country and they're not open to moving to where the jobs are. But if someone graduated and they were willing to go anywhere in the United States or whatever country they lived in, there's always opportunities. There's never a shortage of food science jobs at all different levels. If anything, companies have a hard time filling positions because there's still not that many food scientists out there per jobs that are needed.
Interesting.
So it's very easy. You don't need a portfolio.
Mhm.
Back in my day in the 90s, university office to the department office. And I would say, hey, are there any jobs? And they would post it on a bulletin board outside of the office. And we would send in resumes. The head of the department would get phone calls saying, hey, you have any recent graduates? We need some people to come work here. So it was more just networking back then. But now I can go on LinkedIn and there's dozens of jobs listed at any given time. So, but certain areas have more companies than others. Like the Midwest has many more food companies, just across the Midwest, there's lots of food companies, probably because it's cheaper to have a space in the Midwest than say like San Francisco or New York City. We're usually more in rural or less expensive real estate areas is when you might find a food manufacturing plant. And within that food manufacturing plant, you're going to find food scientists. So, but there's the lucky, exciting food science jobs would be if you get to work in a food lab in downtown San Francisco or New York City or Dallas or Fort Worth or some exciting city. That's a great opportunity because not only do you get to be a food scientist, but you get to live in a place where there's just a lot going on and a lot of activity and things for young graduates to do versus like out in the middle of a cornfield in Illinois where it might not be as exciting to a recent graduate. Maybe that would be better for someone who's gotten all their excitement out of their system and they're like, yeah, I just want to settle in my farmhouse in the cornfield with my family and go to work every day in the middle of nowhere. So there's lots of opportunities in those places. The ones in exciting cities are going to be a little bit more competitive, I guess, just because of the location. But the Bay Area, San Francisco, Bay Area, there do tend to be quite a few jobs out here because of the whole, alt meat, alt cheese, alt hamburgers, alt everything. There's a lot of startups out here that are always needing food scientists to help them take it to the next level. So that's unique for being in the Bay Area is we have that going on in cities, whereas Midwest is kind of more like your existing manufacturers and companies that have been around for a while.
And what are the other hubs? Looks like there are hubs of the food companies.
Yeah, I mean, I think the major places for a food scientist to get a job would be, of course, long-standing companies that have been around a long time. Those are across the U.S. There's also companies that sell ingredients. So that's a huge opportunity for food scientists. Companies that sell flavors or companies that sell starches, they usually will hire many food scientists to help the developers who work in the finished food companies understand how to work with their ingredients. So that's another big opportunity or hub. And then, of course, the whole alt industry in the Bay Area, making protein out of air or making protein out of plants, making precision fermentation, things like that. That's a big field here specifically.
And is food science kind of popular in most of the developed countries like US or Western countries, or is it like internationally how well known it is?
I always felt like there were more food in the early days that food science was more of a known field internationally, especially maybe in developing countries where they really needed food scientists to help feed the people. I feel like in the United States, it was always kind of hard to know in the early days, it was like maybe in the 80s or 90s. Not that many people went into it because they just didn't tell us about it in school. They didn't educate the students on that field, that industry opportunity. A lot of the food scientists in the early days were studying a different science, and they kind of fell into food science because they heard about it. But my theory is that food companies, it's almost like, not that they're ashamed of science, but there's certainly a negative perception towards, oh, my food is a science experiment.
Yeah.
So therefore, food companies, they would never show all the people in the lab coats behind the scenes. They would never highlight or advertise this fact. It was just kind of like, oh, our food is made by elves, Keebler elves, or our food is made by Jolly Green Giants. Like, that was like an image that the public likes to have. But that kind of worked against the food industry because it meant that people didn't know that field existed and they didn't get degrees in it. But I think that's changing. There's a lot more transparency in the world now, and people know and people research what goes into it. But I do still see a lot of negative comments especially from entrepreneurs and smaller companies. They say, oh, we don't want someone in a lab coat making our food. We're going to have our food made by chefs. And I'm like, well, okay, but when your product gets moldy, then what are you going to do when your chef doesn't have a food safety background and know how to, stop that from happening? So I do see comments like that from time to time from uninformed people that don't understand the importance of a food scientist in the food industry. And they like to think that we're just putting chemicals in food and we're just adding preservatives and things like that. And that's not really, yes, we do that, but when it's necessary. So people don't always really completely understand. And that's just, I think, because food companies hid it for a long time.
Now, going back all the way to the early age, like in high school, you said you didn't know much about food science and you got into it and you got lucky. And if we fast forward to today's world, who would likely enjoy this field? Is it more somebody who is inclined towards chemistry, biology, or are there any certain types of inclination that you think would enjoy this field and be successful?
I think it would have to be someone who really enjoys food and likes food a lot and is curious about food. And it can't be someone who is not interested in food. I often come across food scientists who they're just not interested in food. They and I don't really understand that. They're like, yeah, I'm a food scientist. It seemed like a good career to pick, but they don't really want to go out to dinner. They don't really want to go to like a farmer's market and explore new things. Like, it's just not what they're interested in. And I don't really understand that. And eventually people like that don't want to stay in the food industry. They end up doing other things. So it really should be someone who's interested in food, and maybe someone who is interested in food but doesn't want the career, being a career chef, which is hard work. Being a chef is very, very hard. You're working late nights in the kitchen. You're working over a stove. You're on the line. There's a lot of pressure, fine dining and so on, and catering. And that industry doesn't always pay well until you really get up into the senior levels of the industry. I mean, a entry-level chef really doesn't make much money. So someone who's interested in food, but also interested in earning like a good income that would afford them the life that would not be as difficult. It's going to be more of I go into my company, I put on my lab coat, I'm working in like a calm environment where I'm working with other professionals and we're talking about food and I'm doing my experiments, and it's a good life. They're working hard, they're kind of using their minds, they have a science degree. But they still like the food aspect of it. They just didn't want the more challenging life of a chef.
Yeah, makes sense. Sometimes people have either the very glamorous notion of what a job would be, like what the day-to-day would look like, and either very skeptical view of it, right? Especially when they start their work, like in the early stages, in the beginning of their career. What does a life of a food scientist look like? Is it a field job, or is it a mostly lab setting, or is it a desk job? What does it look like?
So at the entry level, a food scientist is going to be really just doing what they're told as they're learning the field. So they're going to be making samples on the bench. They're going to be weighing things, mixing and matching. They're going to be doing a lot of paperwork. They're going to be receiving documentation, processing that paperwork, learning how to manage the paperwork for the food company. There's a lot of paperwork involved in the food industry. Or they might be working in quality control, and you might be on a third shift for that. So you could be going in, and as a production run is occurring of whatever food item that company is making, samples are being pulled off the line, sent to the lab, And that entry-level food scientist is going to be doing microbiology checks on it, or they're going to be running analytical testing and to confirm, yep, this batch is okay. We can continue to produce this and it's going to be packaged up and put out and sold. So it's more tedious, more repetitive work in the early days. Sometimes people get lucky and they get out of college and they get a job where they really get to do a lot of creative tasks that vary every day, and they're traveling a lot and they're visiting other manufacturing plants on behalf of the companies. It just really depends on the person and what job they find. But more often than not, the early jobs are a little more repetitive, more kind of like learning the skills that you need to learn. And then after 5 years, you kind of move into more senior positions where you're directing the newcomers to do that work that you did, and you're doing things that are not as repetitive, or maybe you're figuring out how you can save the company money by switching ingredients, things like that. So yeah, like any field, you kind of advance like as you learn, the trade.
And what does the typical career path look like? Like, is there a certain way career progression happens, and what does it look like?
I mean, I think like other industries, you start off entry level, you learn the ropes, then you might move into like a more of like a managerial type role. Then eventually you're in a senior role. And it just depends on the company, really. When you work for larger companies, I think that the experience and of the food scientist is going to place them in a very specific place with a certain role. Whereas smaller companies, they're going to be a little more flexible. They're going to put the person where they're needed and based on what their interests are and what they can do. I think, and I think that's like that with any job. When you're in a smaller company, you have more opportunities to move around and advance. Whereas in a large company, there's a lot of layers and levels and human resources departments, and say, okay, you've done this job for 3 years, you can advance to like this level. Okay, you've been at this level for a certain number of years. So it just depends on the company and their structure and the opportunities, and of course the individual and how motivated they are to do certain things in their field.
Is there anything like a domain in this? Like, for example, somebody whose expertise or who has worked in a dairy product, they need to keep in that lane, or is it easy to switch whatever is the product type?
I think it just depends on how long you're in a certain area. I think it's easy to move around if you're not, maybe if you're in one area for 20 years and you want to move into like something else, it's going to be hard because you won't really know that field very well. But there are certain skills that you pick up in any job that you could do in any job. So like if someone was a senior quality control manager in one company, they could probably, in a dairy company, they could probably do it in a bakery company or in a different company because the rules are the same. But a product developer who's developing baked goods, it might be tricky for them to jump into yogurt at a senior level. They might have to kind of start like at a lower learning level just to kind of learn about it, or take a short course, or take it upon themselves to learn the industry before they take that job.
Would it all get decided in the first 5-10 years then? Like maybe 5 years that you decide your kind of area?
I mean, not necessarily. I think people have the opportunity, I think, to jump around to different spaces even after 10, 15 years. I mean, someone starts when they're 21 and they're 36. They still have another 20 plus 5 years or so of working if they want. So I don't see why they couldn't jump into like a different space. But, whether that company will hire them will just depend on the competition that's out there and how knowledgeable that person is in that field, maybe that they've learned on their own.
Looking forward, for somebody who is a student today, right, a high schooler or an undergrad, where is the food science industry headed? Like, are there specific areas where there is more focus, or is there something more exciting things happening in certain area than the other? Where do you see what are the trends you expect to take shape in the future?
I think that just again, like the whole Bay Area, alt meat, precision fermentation, that's a really big growing food industry field that didn't exist before. But I think there's always going to be the companies that make the things that they've always made. There's always going to be companies that make bread and yogurt and soda. Of course, everyone's always trying to make reduced sugar, reduced carbs, reduced fat, making healthier products, make designer nutritional products. So there's always those areas. Those have always existed and they'll continue to exist. But I think if anything, probably just the alternative meats and things like that, which are all geared towards better health and also better for the environment and so on.
Mhm. Makes sense. What are some of the resources you would recommend, or what somebody who is interested can do to learn more about this field and plan their education and career as well? What would be some of your advice for them?
Well, the best resource would be the Institute of Food Technologists. That's ift.org. And that organization has been around for a very long time. And there's all kinds of resources on there for someone wanting to get a degree or work in food science.
Mhm.
There's job postings, there's mentor programs, there's newsletters, there's regional groups. I'm part of the Northern California IFT group. There's a Southern California IFT group. There's regions everywhere.
Mhm.
So IFT is really the best resource, and they've really improved quite a bit over the last 10 years. Their website in the past, there was even a few years where I just stopped paying my membership because I felt like there was no value, but
Mhm.
now that's all
Mhm.
changed. I go to their website now and I find it to be very useful, and they've just really improved everything. They reached out to food scientists to find out what we wanted to see in an organization,
Mhm.
because it was just they hadn't really updated their website or their way of doing things from like the 80s.
Mhm.
But now they're very up to date, and I actually rejoined a year or so ago, and I've been really happy. So ift.org, also for people who are interested in the combination of culinary arts and food science, there's the Research Chef Association, that's culinology.org.
Mhm.
And there's also some other smaller organizations. There's the AACT, the American Association of Candy Technologists.
Mm.
That's, and that's for people who are really interested in being in the candy industry. There's another organization called the Dairy Deli, IDDBA, the International Dairy Deli Bake Association. And they're basically dairy deli bakery.
Mhm.
And they actually have free weekly seminars that you can get on their email list. And if you're not a member, you can watch it live when it happens. If you are a member, you can go back and watch the ones that you missed. But if you're not a member, then you can't go back. You have the chances to watch it live.
Mhm.
And there's all kinds of exciting free webinars on about the food industry that one could watch and learn
Mhm.
if that was the path they wanted to go down. So there's just a ton of resources. There's trade shows,
Mhm.
huge trade shows. Like the IFT has their own trade show. There's Expo West. There's Supply Side East, Supply Side West. There's a seafood show coming up in Boston in March, where it's all about the seafood industry. So actually on my website, A la carte Connections, I do have some free downloads. And one of them is a list of food trade
Mhm.
shows that someone could
Mhm.
download and get.
Mhm.
So yeah, so those are some of the good resources that are out there for food scientists or wannabe food
Mhm.
scientists.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Rachel. This was a really very interesting session. And thank you for coming on my podcast, sharing all this knowledge. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we can always use more food scientists in the world. It's as they told me in the 90s, it was guaranteed job placement for life, and so far that's been the case. So
That's really amazing to hear it, especially in the current environment where a lot of industries are facing really difficult times. I think that's very refreshing to hear.
yeah, I mean, it's. I always say that if there's a food scientist that's out of work, it's because they either are not willing to move or not able to move for whatever reason, or they don't want to work, because there are always opportunities in food science at all the different levels.
Mhm.
So if someone is out of work and they want a job, it's out there.
Mhm.
You might have to move, you might have to relocate if there's nothing in your immediate driving location, but there's always opportunities. And I teach a class at San Francisco State in nutrition, and I often tell the students in that class, you're getting a degree in nutrition, and this is a scientific degree. You're learning science. I teach a food science class to the nutritionist, and I tell them that being a nutritionist is much more competitive. Being a dietitian is a more competitive field. If they can't find the job that they want, to keep an open mind and look at food companies that
Mhm.
might want to hire a nutritionist or just someone with a scientific nutritional food background. Sometimes that's enough just to get your foot in the door in a whole other career.
Mhm.
So there's always opportunities. And I've had some nutrition students kind of change their path
Mhm.
because I let them know that there's more than just dietetic jobs out there.
Mhm.
Not that I want to steer them away from being a dietitian if they want to be, but if there's not enough jobs and they need to work, then they
Yeah.
should just keep an open mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. That definitely makes sense. Thank you very much for coming on my podcast.
This is Career Calling, and I'm your host, Pratibha Pandit.
For more contents like this, please don't forget to subscribe, leave a rating, or a comment. Thank you for tuning in.